Hello, this is BBC News, the headlines. Israel's Prime Minister insists he will press ahead with an offensive in Rafah, where around 1.5 million Palestinians have taken refuge. The UN says there is nowhere safe in Gaza for them to go, but Benjamin Netanyahu says enough of the hostages are alive to justify the operation. NATO has hit back at remarks by Donald Trump that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell it wants to any NATO ally that fails to meet its financial obligations to the alliance. The White House has condemned the comments as appalling and deranged. Police in Pakistan have used tear gas to break up protests by supporters of jailed former Prime Minister Imran Khan, alleging vote rigging in the election. Final results confirm that candidates he backed won the most seats in Parliament. You're watching BBC News. Well, now it's time for Sunday's episode of Newscast with Laura Kuenssberg, Paddy O'Connell and Henry Zeffman.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Laura in the studio.
And it's Henry at home.
Well, this morning on Laura's show and on the front page of the FT, Michael Gove. On my programme, we had Alan Bates, of which more in a moment. Michael Gove said in this Sunday Times that I read that young people are being stitched up by the housing crisis.
He did. And he also said that young people might lose faith in democracy if they don't get the houses that they need. Now, as you've already alluded to, for somebody who's been basically in government for 14 years, normally with a bum on the seat at the cabinet table, it's a slightly curious thing for him to be pointing the finger in this way at this big notion that somehow this is a terrible, terrible problem and now it must be turned to, whereas people who study the housing market, you can pick up any set of statistics under the sun to show you that the issue has become more and more and more and more acute under 14 years of Conservative government. So there's a bit of a weird element to Michael Gove kind of trying to make like a bystander here. The backstory, of course, is what he's busily doing is trying to persuade other people in government to make sure the legislation he wants to pass actually goes through, and he wants more money for housing in the budget. So if you were being scurrilous, you might suggest that there are lots of different motivations here.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you talk to anyone around Michael Gove, it's clear that he has kind of got religion on housing and its importance, not just to the Conservative Party, whose problem with young voters seems to be more acute than perhaps it ever has been, but also to society. I mean, it's an incredibly stark thing for any cabinet minister to say, their particular policy area risks, if it's not done properly, meaning that people turn away from democracy and towards authoritarianism. But there are a lot of politicians, Conservative and other parties, who fear that the kind of intergenerational contract is breaking down when you have overwhelmingly middle-aged and old people who are owner-occupiers in this country and overwhelmingly young, which is not necessarily that young. We're not talking 27-year-olds anymore. Yeah. We're talking people who are substantially older who just can't get on the housing market and therefore feel they have less stake in society.
And we pay respect to viewers and listeners who are older and built their wealth themselves. We're not having a knock. You've done well, you've worked hard, congratulations. But my programme sent me back to the first house I bought, age 25. The multiplier of my salary was 3. And I went to the same house, the same front door. The multiplier to buy that house now of the average wage is 10.
Wow.
10 times.
And that's a really good illustration of what has happened right across the piece. And the numbers are really, really stark. The graphs all go the wrong way, with the knock-on effect, huge increase in evictions, huge increase in the number of people in temporary accommodation, more than 1 million people on the waiting list for social housing, what we would have called council housing in the old days when things were a bit more simple and there weren't housing association and all sorts of different players in the market. So we were talking to Michael Gove about this big picture and this big political point that he is now ready to make, that housing really should be at the top of the list. But we also were asking him about some of the specifics, because in 2019, the Tories promised to ban what are called no-fault evictions. So basically, if you do nothing wrong as a tenant, you pay your bills on time, currently, as it stands, your landlord can still get you out. They made a promise in 2019, still hasn't happened yet. Is he now sure that it will happen before the next election?
You promised in 2019 in your manifesto that you were going to get rid of what's called Section 21,
where landlords can evict tenants for no reason.
Yes.
It hasn't happened yet. Can you guarantee the 11 million renters in this country that you will end this before the general election?
Yes, we have a bill. It's gone through its stages in the House of Commons, and that bill does a number of things to help people in the private rented sector, including ending no-fault evictions. Why does that matter, some might ask? Well, it is the case that there are a small minority of unscrupulous landlords who use the threat of eviction either to jack up rents or to silence people who are complaining about the quality of their homes. It's important that we deal with that abuse because the vast majority of landlords do a great job, and you need a healthy private rented sector as part of a balanced housing economy.
You are explicitly saying this morning that practice will be banned. It will not be allowed to happen before the next general election.
That's what it says in the bill. The bill ends section 21.
But there's a different factor here, because previously you've said, well, the courts might not be able to cope, so we might bring in the new law, but it actually might still happen because the courts aren't ready. So I ask you again, just to be really explicit, will this practice have ended by the time of the next general election?
We will have outlawed it, and we will have put the money into the courts in order to ensure that they can enforce that.
OK. Now, the reason I was pushing him to be so explicit there is because there have been Tory MPs who've been, dragging their feet on this issue. There's a sort of, I don't want to say conspiracy theory, some housing campaigners believe that there are Tory MPs who are landlords who have been dragging their feet on this legislation. And there is the question, which we alluded to there, that even if it's in place, the government previously said, well, we'll pass the law, but we can't tell you when it's actually going to come into force. There, however, Henry, I think Michael Gove is going, I think, further than he has done previously to give his absolute guarantee that it will happen in both regards.
I can upgrade that conspiracy theory or whatever theory it may be, because I've not just heard it from housing campaigners, I've heard it from Conservative MPs and ministers who are desperate for this bill to pass and believe that their own colleagues in the government are dragging their heels because some of them have property interests. I'm not commenting on whether that is a legitimate theory or not, but that is the level of person I have heard.
Well, hang on. So the thing that would put a screw on a landlord is being resisted by landlord MPs. That's what we're saying on Newscast.
We're saying that that's what people believe.
MPs and ministers say.
Right. So, I mean, it's important we must speak in one sentence, because that's really going to annoy Generation Rent.
Absolutely.
And, and again, there's a programme to do about landlords, because without landlords, there are really no homes. So,
and lots of people are landlords and are not wealthy. Right. And lots of people might have a small flat, which they've saved up for, which is instead of having a pension. So
write to us about that, because we don't want to disown that. But that's a big issue. On the same day that he's on the front page of the Sunday Times saying this is going to lock people out of democracy, Henry Zeffman and Laura Kuenssberg are telling me there are MPs in the House of Commons who are said to be dragging their feet because they're landlords.
And note how categorical, as Laura says, Michael Gove was about the timetable there. Yeah. He really didn't leave himself any wriggle room at all. He said, this bill will be passed by the time of the general election. Well, there's not we don't know when the general election is, of course, but assume it's in the autumn rather than in May. I mean, if it's in May, I don't really see how this could be passed in time. But if it's in the autumn, there's still not a lot of parliamentary time. It's got the entirety of its House of Lords stages to go through. It's a bit of stuff still to be done in the House of Commons, and some people are unsure when any of that is going to take place. So I think that is Michael Gove, chivying the government along as well as announcing that it's going to happen.
Absolutely. And I know newscasters love this kind of stuff, because sometimes politicians are talking to two audiences. So one, Michael Gove is trying to tell our viewers, our listeners today, I get it. I know this isn't good enough. And if you give us another chance, I promise you I'm going to try and sort it. But also saying to Downing Street, to Tory party managers, to his Tory colleagues, this has to happen. And I'm going to go and get my megaphone on the telly and really try to push it forward. Because there isn't a guarantee, if you talk to other people in government, that this is going to happen before the election. He is trying to make it so.
Right, let me bring this back to the audience that really does matter. That's the renter, the newscaster. You had a case study called Sian.
Yes.
Let's not just talk about the Westminster bubble, let's talk about her living room.
So Sian has been in temporary accommodation for 6 years. 6 years. I mean, go back 6 years, we're still in 2018. My mental arithmetic
I don't think
has
you should
already
do
failed
any
me once on this programme. But Sian has been in temporary accommodation for 6 years, waiting to get a place in social housing. There are more than 1 million people on the list. And Sian wanted basically Michael Gove just to explain himself. How's that acceptable in one of the richest countries in the world? This is what he had to say.
One of our viewers, Sian, wants you to explain to her why she has been stuck on a waiting list along with more than 1 million other people for social housing and stuck in temporary accommodation for 6 years. Now, you can boast about the number of homes you built, but can you explain to her why the Conservatives have allowed that to happen?
I would never boast. I think it's important, however, to stress what it is that we've been doing.
I'd like you to explain to our viewer, Sian, why she's been waiting for 6 years for a home.
Again, I don't know where Sian lives, and do share the details with me so I can make sure that we do everything that we can to help her. More broadly, we need to deliver more homes. I've run through some of the things that we're doing in order to do that. But let me make one important point. Last year, we introduced legislation that would have unlocked 100,000 new homes. Social homes, homes to rent, and homes to buy. When we brought forward that legislation, the opposition voted against it. So if we're looking for culpability and blame, one of the questions we have to ask is why, when we could have had 100,000 additional homes, did Labour vote to stop that? And that's because we have a plan to deal with this very important question, and Labour have no plan at all.
I think that's what's known as not answering the question and trying to point the finger at your opponent instead. So we will see if Sian gets back in touch with us to see what she made of that answer.
Henry, it's interesting to hear Michael Gove say, please share her information with me. It's just a sideline from me. He is seen, isn't he, as one of the most sort of adept cabinet performers. When you think that Laura Trott was on the PM programme in the week gone by, arguing with Evan Davis over what figure is a figure.
Arguing with Evan Davis about figures is, right. I mean, that way lies.
I mean, you do go and look at that if you have. But the thing is, Michael Gove, that's really sophisticated to say, let me know what Sian's position is, Henry. So do we say that Michael Gove is going to be wheeled out like David Cameron as the sort of competent face of the cabinet?
Oh, I'm sure that Rishi Sunak would be delighted for him to do as much media as possible. I mean, David Cameron, by the way, side note, still not being wheeled out that much, as we discussed on Newscast a few weeks ago, on the sole occasion that he has been, which I still think is quite interesting subplot. But, I mean, there's definitely a divide, isn't there, in the cabinet now? A really big, profound divide in terms of experience. You've got Michael Gove, who's been doing media interviews like this on national television like this for getting on for 20 years now. He's been MP since 2005. Obviously, actually, he was a journalist beforehand, but, you know, he's very experienced. He first joined the cabinet in 2010. You know, ditto David Cameron, obviously, Jeremy Hunt, Grant Shapps. And then you've got people at the other end of the cabinet who are much fresher to this sort of thing. And I think Rishi Sunak would like to go into the election and promote them as much as possible as the sort of new face of a Conservative Party. But they often come unglued on sticky wickets, whereas people like Michael Gove, you know, handle difficult questions like that probably a bit more smoothly.
So let me segue, because you've made the news with Michael Gove. We had Alan Bates on Broadcasting House today because the BBC's done some digging into Fujitsu UK's accounts to find that millions were paid to executives during the Horizon fiasco, the software that was faulty. 900 sub-postmasters and mistresses were pursued through the courts and prosecuted over these mistakes that were in the system. And at the same time, Fujitsu UK was paying the bosses millions. And Alan Bates told me this needs to be looked into in the inquiry.
The really important thing in all of this is getting the victims, the sub-postmasters who suffered, paid as soon as possible. I mean, I don't know why government cannot get the money out to these people. It just seems to be tied up in a bureaucratic nightmare. Everyone agrees the money's there. Everyone agrees that they want to pay them.
Laura, it's amazing how long this has been going on. It's just years.
Oh, it's years and years and years and years and years. And Alan Bates, you know, of course, was one of the original campaigners on all of this, who now has, you know, got this sort of big national voice. When you were talking to him, Paddy, I just wonder, can he sort of believe how this is all now unravelled? I mean, it must be a strange position to be in if you've been somebody who was fighting on your own, then with a small group, then with a bigger group, then with another. You know, what's his sort of take on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly where I was interested to go, because he says, look, the money's still not coming.
Yeah.
There's lots of promises of action. Now, there has been some, but they can't believe how slow it is. And then when you link that to the Windrush scandal and the contaminated blood scandal, you know, people who are against the system feel very depressed in our country. So I asked him, is the system knackered? And he said, it's, you know, you feel very lonely. But interesting, he was laughing. He's saying, oh, you know, my life's busy, but he's got this manner about him where he feels he's done all he can. And I suppose that is enough for a person, that they've got agency. And so he was laughing and saying he's had a nice day. Henry, you're nodding.
Well, no, I just think that point you made about agency feels so important in the Post Office scandal. Is I think one of the things that I found most powerful about the ITV drama, about Alan Bates, but the case more generally was, you know, that feeling that these people were sounding the alarm, they were campaigning, they were calling, you know, in the first instance, Post Office and Fujitsu, and expecting them to help them out of the situation and you know, treat it as an honest mistake. And the sort of agency point, you know, it's taken them decades in some cases to just get a hearing to, you know, what any human being can expect, you know, ought to be able to expect in any walk of life, right? Which is just being listened to.
Fair hearing. It's interesting. We had Pat McFadden on the programme this morning, who's now Labour's campaign chief, but he was one of the politicians who was the Post Office minister for a while. Now, he was asked a couple of weeks ago about all of this, and he basically said, I can't really remember. I said, have you gone back and looked at what happened, given everything that we now know? And he said, yeah, I have gone back and I've looked at the paperwork. And what really struck me, he said this morning, is how robust the Post Office was to the inquiries that were being put to them by government. So we said, yeah, we asked a couple of times, but the Post Office came back time and time and time again saying, there's no problem, there's no problem, there's no problem. Now, when you speak to people who were at the Post Office at the time, they sometimes say, we were being told by Fujitsu, there's no problem, there's no problem, there's no problem. But it is one of these things. It is absolutely astonishing how these people have taken so long to actually have this looked at properly. And although, you know, Kemi Badenoch said on the show a couple of weeks ago, oh yeah, we're going as fast as we can, it's all happening really quickly, there is still, as you heard from Alan Bates' thing this morning, it's glacial for many of the people whose lives have been turned upside down.
Some have died, obviously, because of the length of time. And Henry, I wonder if Ed Davey has got more of this coming his way. I understand that there's a fair-minded listener will say, if I'm the minister and I ask my officials and the Post Office for reassurance, that's all I can do. I'm not a private investigator. And actually, Vince Cable made a similar point, but he said he would like to apologise.
Yes.
Do we think that Ed Davey's got more of this coming to slap him round the face?
Yeah, almost certainly, because he, you know, there were a long line of Post Office ministers, but he's the one who has the misfortune to be a leader of a political party at the moment that this scandal is finally recognised. He did an interview on the Today programme this week, which I think was meant to be about other things. I can't even remember what, because most of it was occupied with relitigating some of these questions.
And you're blaming the Post Office, advice you were given, what was happening at the time. What about your own personal responsibility?
Well, I take that very seriously. It's one of the reasons why when we heard about the whistleblower and we had the High Court judgment, I called for an independent inquiry. I've championed that, and I'm very keen to give my evidence.
And an apology to all of the victims?
Well, I have apologised for the fact that I failed to see through the lies of the Post Office, that I failed to meet Alan Bates early enough. Is that a
full apology,
though?
Well,
I think it's apologising for things that I can be held accountable for.
But I think worth noting, Pat McFadden's defence is exactly the same as Ed Davey's defence, which is that they were being told by their officials, by the Post Office, indirectly, I guess, by Fujitsu, that everything was fine. And not a single postal affairs minister in this long stretch did anything other than trust their officials' advice, because, of course, government ministers habitually do trust their officials' advice. Otherwise, we've got a problem. So, you know, I think Ed Davey would probably not unreasonably make that point.
So, Paddy, we don't just do politics on Sundays, do we? We like to have Sunday sparkle and a bit of showbiz. And yesterday you told me that you were going to have Mark Knopfler on, and I wanted to know if he'd play you a tune. Did he play you any tunes?
Well, I said, of course, because I just wanted to, big my part. But no, he spoke very eloquently and movingly about the theme from Local Hero, Going Home, which was his first
tune.
Yeah. And he said it's very Celtic. And to you might hear the Scots in you stirring. But it's also been the Geordie anthem for Newcastle United. Henry's a big footy fan. It's used on every match day at home.
It's got a little Newcastle United tribute T-shirt on under your red corduroy, Henry.
Yeah,
I've just seen.
exactly, yeah.
Black and white stripes
Covering
for
all
those of you
bases.
who are listening.
But he's got the Stephen Gerrard shrine. But Knopfler's described for us on the radio today, Henry, what it's like to hear your tune played in the tune, to your fans. It's like it's an emotional, life-changing moment for him.
I'm sure it is. I mean, I think it's sort of unimaginable for us, isn't it? But it must be. Is Mark Knopfler a Newcastle fan, by the way? I don't actually know the answer to that.
Yes. No.
Oh, he must be.
Totally, yes,
yeah,
he is.
He must be. But also we had incredible sort of passion on that. And we had incredible passion from Ralph Fiennes this morning. He was talking about his new Macbeth production in London. It's already been in Liverpool, Edinburgh, around the country, which is in like big warehouses, so not in like posh, plush theatres, but in big warehouses. And he said there's lots of violence, there's lots of gore, which of course Macbeth is all about that. But it was interesting this morning. He said that they don't have a trigger warning at Macbeth. And he basically said, actually, I think audiences have gone too soft. Like, part of the thing of being in the theatre is that you can be shocked. You should be shocked. You shouldn't be told about it in advance.
That's fascinating.
Isn't that interesting?
Really interesting.
So down with trigger warnings if you're Ralph Fiennes.
I think we didn't used to have trigger warnings. I mean, there are very disturbing scenes in Macbeth. There are terrible murders and things. But I think the impact of theatre should be that you're shocked and you should be disturbed. I don't think you should be prepared for these things. And when I was young, we never had trigger warnings for shows.
So would you get rid of them then?
I would, yes, I would.
It's just fascinating talking about the theatre in that way because it's a massive staple for the Sunday papers, this wokery thing.
Yeah.
Henry, you used to work in the papers, and the idea that you give a trigger warning to an audience saying, now, Macbeth, you may be upset because there'll be some witchery and, someone's head's cut off early on. I mean, it does. You can see why the papers love this stuff.
Well, and Macbeth is so well known, isn't it, that if you're going to see it, you presumably have at least a rough idea of the plot and particular things you might expect. I mean, Ralph Fiennes drew a distinction with you, didn't he, Laura?
Yeah.
He said, if there's things like strobe lighting and so on,
Yes.
of course, you warn people beforehand. Although that's more a sort of safety warning, isn't it?
Well, I think that was his point. If it's safety, it's about people's health, then for sure.
Yeah. And here are the fire exits.
Right.
All very important.
Yes.
But, Macbeth contains blood and a bit of murder. I mean, good for him. He's influential.
Are you auditioning, Paddy, to be a sort of theatre announcer saying you might find scenes in this distressing, look away now if you're of a nervous disposition?
The argument on the other side is that Macbeth is an incredibly well-known play. There are plenty, albeit perhaps fewer than there used to be, of new plays being put on. And perhaps if some of them have really traumatic elements that some people might not want to relive if they've experienced, it's worth giving them a bit of a heads up. But certainly Ralph Fiennes seems to speak for a lot of people on the ridiculousness of some of the extremes it's gone to.
And sorry, Laura.
And to complete our loviness, our love of loviness, you had Andrew Scott on Broadcasting House this morning.
Yeah. So
what a bunch of awful name droppers we are. What was he talking about?
Well, he was talking about his love of event cinema. That's where millions of us see ballet, plays and concerts. The Taylor Swift and Beyonce concert tour films have sort of broken the box office records in the last 12 months. But for 15 years or more, people have been enjoying plays in this way. Andrew Scott's Vanya is going to be screened on NT Live this month. But along the way, he did say that it can't replace affordable theatre prices. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they'll go back to where we started. He said people of about 25 can't afford your £150 box office ticket.
If you're having to spend 150 quid, no person between the age of 16 and 25 or beyond is going to be able to afford that. It's frustrating to me. Usually, hopefully, there's some night or 2 nights a week where you can get something, but you just, like a sale rack, you have to sort of be prepared to rummage a little bit. But I agree. I think it's important that it doesn't remain an elitist art form.
Well, I did ask Ralph Fiennes if he would pay 300 quid to go and see Sarah Jessica Parker, and he confessed that he had been, but he got a freebie because it was opening night.
Wow. Well done.
So, lucky if you can get a free ticket, but 300 quid for Sarah Jessica Parker, that's a lot of cash.
So we've done a lot of shout-outs today for our 27-year-old newscaster.
Yes.
We congratulate the Plaid Cymru Pia, who's 27.
She'd come on and talk to us.
Come on. And Henry, we congratulate you on fabulous corduroy. I'm with you. It's the way to go. I think we're at the end, is what I mean.
I think we're probably at the end if we're talking about your sartorial choices. I mean, I'm always happy to do that. I'm just not sure how happy or how much of discussion of our sartorial choices that newscasters really want to listen to. Although I have had an email from a viewer this morning saying, can you wear a bigger jumper in the studio in order to set an example of turning the heating down and wearing more clothes?
Right.
Because we were talking about climate change.
Okay.
So, you never know.
And the week ahead, Henry, is massive for politics.
Huge. 2 big by-elections on Thursday in Wellingborough in Northamptonshire and in Kingswood near Bristol. Both seats that the Conservatives won with very big majorities at the 2019 general election, and it tells you a story of how far we've come. But I don't think anybody seriously expects the Conservatives to hold on to either of them under challenge from the Labour Party. It's just become routine now. You have these by-elections with big Tory majorities, and invariably, it seems, Labour overturns them.
And it might set up another wobble in the Tory ranks, but they're pretty wobbly as things stand. We might also get this week figures showing that we have actually gone into recession.
Really?
Yes, I think on Thursday also. In fact, it might even be the day of the by-elections, which, given that the government's trying to make an argument, stick with us because we're the ones who can count up and look after the economy, whether or not being technically in recession makes a blind bit of difference to how people feel about making ends meet. It is still a stick for the opposition to beat them with if indeed those figures do show that.
We have reviewed the Sundays and we have previewed the week ahead. So it's definitely a time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for listening and watching.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello there. Very pleased to say it's been a quieter weekend of weather for most of us, but there's still a lot of waterlogged fields and pavements out there, as you can see by this Weather Watcher picture sent in from Hull a little earlier on. Now, as we go through the week ahead, we might start off quite optimistic with some sunny spells around, but it will turn increasingly unsettled with the showers turning to longer spells of rain, breezy at times. But it will be mild, particularly through the middle part of the week. This has been the story today. We've had some nuisance rain just clinging onto the far east coast of Scotland and northeast England, some brighter spells and a few scattered showers out to the west. Now, those showers will continue to feed in across west-facing coasts overnight, but with some clearer skies, temperatures are likely to fall away. It's going to be a chilly start to our Monday morning. Low single figures for many, perhaps in rural parts of Scotland below freezing. A touch of ice not out of the question where we've got those lingering showers. Low pressure dominates the scene as we move into Monday. The wind direction coming from a northwesterly, slightly fresher source, and that's going to continue to drive in plenty of showers closest to that area of low. So Northern Ireland, Scotland, perhaps northwest England as well. And some of the showers to the tops of the mountains, once again, could be wintry in nature, but there will be some sunshine elsewhere, and those temperatures are likely to peak between 6 and 10 degrees. As we go through Monday evening and into Tuesday, got this little ridge of high pressure keeping things quiet, but all the time this weather front is approaching from the southwest. That is going to gradually spill in more cloud ahead of it, so after a bright start clouding over, a few scattered showers in the far northwest. More persistent showery rain develops across the Channel Isles, southwest England, Wales, and eventually into the Midlands, northwest England and Northern Ireland by the end of the afternoon. 7 to 11 are overall highs. So as we move out of Tuesday into Wednesday, it's here where the showers potentially could merge to longer spells of rain as it stays pretty unsettled. The wind direction, though, coming from a southwesterly, so a very mild direction, and that is going to just push that milder air further north across the country. So it does mean that we could see temperatures perhaps into the mid-teens as we go through the middle part of the week, but it stays pretty unsettled for many of us. Take care.